Okay, good morning, and thank you for those who are joining us for today's pre-budget webinar. My name is Lauren Wilkins, and answering questions today we have Matthew Denny and Gus Williams, who I'll allow to introduce themselves. Matthew, do you want to start?
Yeah, so for those who don't know me, I'm Matthew Denny. I'm a tax partner at Bevan Buckland. Gus?
Gus Williams, CEO of Bevan Buckland, but also CEO at the South Wales Chamber of Commerce. So in that role, I get invited into a lot of the discussion and consultations at various levels of government. So hopefully can offer some of the political insight on this webinar.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank
Gus.
you both. So as most of you will be aware, the budget will be held on the 26th of November, so 2 weeks today. As we're getting closer to that date, we're seeing increasing what we'd call kite flying in the media, speculating possible changes that will or could take effect in coming months or years. Since the last budget, there's been various changes. We've seen failure to deliver welfare cuts, which has cost approximately 2 billion a year. We saw the cut of winter fuel payment and then the U-turn of that. And now we're seeing increasing speculation that there'll be cuts to the two-child benefit cap. Alongside that, we've seen anemic growth of a maximum of 1%. But the OBR has recently reduced that by 0.3%. And then to go with that, the debt is still rising. I think the current figure is around 2.9 trillion, which is sitting at 96.3% of GDP. And the interest on that debt is running above what the OBR has forecast. I think recent studies have shown that 10% of tax revenues are spent on financing that debt alone, with debt projected with debt interest projected to be at 111.2 billion for 25-26 alone. So that has all shaped the narrative behind this year's budget, with the estimated £30 billion black hole, which seems to be dominating the news headlines. The combined effect of lower than projected growth and higher than projected costs, and alongside failure to deliver spending cuts, is the difficult context for this budget. It seems that some kind of tax rises are inevitable. Of course, the question there is which taxes are most likely to be hit and how effective will they be at filling the black hole. So we'll be discussing the different taxes in turn. And of course, all of you can write in your questions in the Q&A box, which we'll review, and hopefully we'll have some time to answer. So that's just a bit of an introduction set in the economic context.
If I can
Gus?
just, yeah,
Yeah.
if I can just offer a little bit more political context to that. A lot of you may have seen in the news last couple of days rumours of Web Streeting making a move. It has been a fairly badly kept secret for a month or two now that Wes Streeting has got the numbers in the Parliamentary Labour Party to trigger a leadership election. I have it on pretty good authority that he has already set up his leadership campaign team. Um, so despite what he is saying in the media this morning, he is, from what I've heard, he's ready to go. It could happen after this budget, or it could happen after the next, after the local elections in May. So the political stakes for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves around this budget are massive. It's do they keep their jobs, or do they lose their jobs? And I think that that's part of the reason. That's certainly the reason why we've seen announcements recently that they're going to drop the two-child benefit cap, because that's one of the top priorities of a lot of Labour MPs. So that's clearly trying to get some Labour MPs back on side. Um, but it's also probably the reason why we've seen just so many leaks over the last couple of months, as they desperately trying to figure out what's going to land and what's not going to land.
Thank you, Gus. So various reports of various taxes that could be changes have dominated the news headlines recently. I thought we'd start by looking at some of the taxes that have had very little media attention, and that would be corporation tax and VAT. Now, corporation tax has recently seen changes, right, with the main rate rising to 25% in April 2023. Both, do you think there'd be any further changes in the upcoming budget?
No. So you actually say corporation tax is as high as it's been since 2007 when it was 30%. No speculation. We've got to be competitive across Europe, EU, OECD, whichever it might be. So that, if you look at the rates across everywhere else, where we're not the most expensive, but neither are we the cheapest. So I can't see there's much to do there. VAT's never, 20% is the highest it's ever been. There was a 25% rate way back, but that was for sort of luxury goods. It hits everybody. It hits the working people. So I think we can just put those two to bed and go, unlikely to see anything there.
Yeah, and the disastrous way the last budget has been taken by businesses, the government is extremely conscious of the fact that business confidence and the business mood is bad. They've had that feedback constantly for 12 months. So I can't see them doing anything in terms of some of the blanket big taxes on business. It would just kill business confidence and double down on the sort of frustration and anger that's already out there.
Yeah. There have been calls for a reduction in VAT on hospitality, which is not unprecedented because, of course, we had several rates
Yeah.
on hospitality during COVID. And with hitting hospitality with employers' NI increases, which is more painful for hospitality because not only are they impacted by the increase to 15%, but they're more impacted by the reduction in the threshold down to, I think, 5,000 because they tend to have more temporary staff. So I've not seen. I don't think it will happen. I think people are lobbying for it, but I can't see that happening either, I'm afraid, for those in hospitality.
Okay, thank you both for that. So now we'll go on to the other two big taxes, which would be income tax and national insurance. I think there's been increasing speculation about increases in income tax by 1 or 2%, possibly alongside a reduction in NI. What do you both think of these changes?
I sort of come in with the figures, and then I'll let Gus comment on how he sees it politically. So, um, the reality is that income tax and national insurance nearly make up half of the total revenues that the government receives each year of around about 1 trillion. So income tax is around 270 billion and national insurance 172. I think Gus will talk about all the fudges and the political nature for that. But from a pure tax point of view, that would move the dial. So a 1% increase in income tax would in 26-27 do about 8.5 billion, rising to 10.5 billion by 28-29. But it has to be across the band, so the basic rate, the higher rate, and the additional rate. So if I look at just sort of 26-27, that's sort of 8.5 billion, 7 billion of that comes from the basic rate. So, I've had this speculation of defining a working person as someone who earns under £45,000. I have no idea where that's come from and whether it's related. But the reality is it's got to be across the band. There's 7 billion at the basic rate, 1.6 billion at the higher rate. And of course, more people are dragged into the higher rate because the bands aren't changing because of fiscal drag. And I think it's only moving to a maximum of 250 million at the additional rate. That's what would currently be the 45% rate. So that's the numbers. What do you think of the politics, Gus?
Yeah, there's and the last Labour government certainly wasn't the only one guilty of this. We've had this for sort of 15, 20 years. The governments have sort of tinkered around the edges of the tax scheme to sort of raise the odd billion here and there, try and keep things like income tax the same. And the reason they're doing that is to try and hit this sort of golden target of the OBR. Because they've given themselves they've given the markets a stick with which to beat themselves in terms of sticking to the OBR forecasts around around net borrowing and things, and it's a bit of a nonsense. But the dawning reality is that the current hole cannot be filled simply by tinkering around the edges of some of the minor taxes and trying to sort of sneakily raise the odd billion here and there. So it's almost certain that they're going to have to hit one of the big ones, and income tax is frankly the easiest one to hit. So it seems like it's almost certain that to fill their sort of 30-40 billion pounds hole, they're going to have to increase income tax rates.
And the question is whether it's 1% or 2%. And I suspect it will be 1%, unless, of course, they go for the reduction in employees' NI and self-employed NI by, say, 2%, but then increase the rate of income tax by 2%. The idea being that bring it sort of the working individual is no worse or better off because it's neutral, and then it brings pensioners, landlords, those with investment income into a higher rate of tax. And it's estimated that a 2% swap would raise 6 billion. So it could even be a bit of
I,
both.
I think it's highly likely there's a huge, partly driven by the numbers and the reality, the proportion of sort of income, however you want to define it, that falls outside of NI has been steadily increasing for a very long time and is going to increase. Um, so, and NI was a fudge in itself way back in the day to sort of raise income tax without seeming like you're raising income tax. So there's certainly a lot of noise out of government around this fact that they need to try and level up between that income which is that accumulates NI and that which doesn't. Um, so again, I think that's probably the way they're going to try and spin this as not increasing taxes on working people, is to try and squeeze as much of that income tax rise out of a readjustment between NI and income tax.
And I think the reason they're going there is because they've already done dividend tax to death. So it wasn't all that long ago that if you dividends came with a tax credit. And so if you're a basic rate taxpayer, you paid no tax on your dividend income.
Yeah.
And if you were a higher rate taxpayer, before we had additional rates of tax, you effectively paid 25%. Now we've got a situation where the dividend rates are such that in actual fact, if you are an owned and managed business, you've got your own company, there's very little difference now between whether you extract your profits as salary or dividends. And so increasing the dividend rates yet further will just change the behaviors to, well, actually, okay, I'll start taking my profit as salary rather than a dividend. So my sense is they've really there is speculation of increasing dividend rates again, but I think they've pushed that envelope as far as they need to push it, and therefore they need to look at other ways of taxing that earned income, the unearned income and the wealth, rather than the earned income.
And I think the political discussion at the heart of that is, do you go after dividends, which will enrage an already upset business community,
Yeah.
or do you go after effectively, pensioners' income, which has been a political no-no for decades because of the power of the pensioners voting bloc. But I think I think it's politically the worst of two out of that would be to hit business again now. So one suspects that they're going to go after sort of trying to close this gap on the fact that pensioners don't pay NI and increase their income tax.
And lots of businesses pay dividends as their form of salary.
Yeah.
So it hits a lot of owner managed businesses.
Okay, thank you both for that. Just wanted to follow up with something. Recently in the news, we've seen this speculation that there could be a restriction of £2,000 on salary sacrifice pension contributions. How does that fit in with the income tax and national insurance discussions?
Yeah, so from a tax perspective, this would be a situation where we currently have a annual allowance of £60,000 for pension contributions. That annual allowance can be tapered down if your income is over a certain amount, a couple of £100,000. And it can also be restricted by your earnings. So you can only actually contribute into pension earnings. So even if you had a £30,000 salary and £100,000 of dividends, it doesn't matter. You might have a £60,000 allowance. You could actually only put your £30,000 of net relevant earnings into pension. What happens at the moment, typically, particularly for owner managed businesses, is that they, rather than taking a salary to have the earnings on which to make the pension contribution, and of course, if they've taken the salary, the company will have paid the 15% NI, they'll have paid the employees NI. When they then make the pension contribution, they don't get any of that NI back. Okay, and I think um, I think we've had a bit of both. So there would be under typical contractual employment arrangement, there would be maybe 5%, say, the employer would make, and there'd be no NI on that, and then the employee might match that, or more likely the employer matches the employee's contribution. But the employee's contribution was typically after paying all those NICs. And sort of what happened in reality is that um, everyone realized, well, actually, why don't we just sacrifice the salary into pension in order to avoid all the NI? And it became more and more popular. And it didn't just become more and more popular in pensions, it became more popular in the most ridiculous places. At one point, even and the irony is you had government organizations doing this. So in fact, some government organizations were the worst culprits for taking advantage of salary sacrifice to avoid the employers and employees' NI. And at one point, you'd even get your washing machine. I mean, literally, you'd get your washing machine, and then you'd lease it, and then anyway. So we've probably had it a bit too good in some respects, and particularly it was useful for owner managed businesses because, of course, they could very easily just go, well, it wasn't even really salary sacrifice. It was just, they just didn't pay themselves a salary. It just went straight into their pension instead. So it would be quite unfortunate if we had a 15%, and the employees' NI at the different rates on those pension contributions. So that's what it's about. Do I think it's going to happen? I don't know. I'm going to hand that one to Gus. I have
Well,
no idea.
so so Thorsten Bell, who happens to be our MP here in Swansea, is pensions minister, but it's sort of, I think it's beyond rumored that he is at the heart. He's sort of the intellectual driving force of this current budget process, and he is pensions minister. Um, so I think pensions somehow are going to feature quite heavily in this budget. The bigger economic issue that he sees with pensions is we've got an enormous amount of pension wealth in this country, and it's sort of sitting there not really doing anything, is the view. It sort of sits in fairly low risk assets. We don't, we're so there's two sides to that. One, are we stuffing too much money into pensions? So do you use it to solve, as you just said, Matt, do you use it to solve um, some of the sort of the tax hole that they need to solve at the moment? Or do you need to look at it the other side, that we need to get this financial wealth working to sort of to drive business investment and productivity somehow? Um, I don't know which side of the argument they'll sort of come down on. I think more of the work is being done. The bigger concern they have is we've got trillions of pounds in assets that are not seen to be, investing in improving productivity and growing the economy here. So I think we'll see some around that. Depending how much this comes back to the fact, are they just going to say, right, we're just going to do, and I've certainly lobbed on this, are we just going to do two or three fairly straightforward things to fill this 40 billion back hole? Or are we going to do 20 little changes to try and find a few billion here and there, and just make the sort of tax system more complicated. So
Yeah.
that's the sort of discussion that's happening, I think, in government at the moment.
I think it's probably worth saying this is going to upset people greatly, particularly this audience, because I suspect none of them have nice civil service type pensions. But if we think back to why we have the annual allowance of £60,000, it was and why we got rid of the lifetime allowance, which was about £1 million. It was really driven by mainly doctors, but those with what we call final, like an old-fashioned final salary pension or a defined benefits pension, where you don't physically put money into your, well, you may, sometimes you actually do, but you generally don't sort of physically put cash into your pension pot and have a pot of money. It's a promise. And so your pension contribution is determined in a sort of actuarial basis. And what was happening was effectively was doctors were paying income tax on sort of deemed pension contributions, so getting tax bills, but not, no money to, not the income to pay it. Now there was a what calls a schemes pay arrangement, but it was causing the wrong sort of behaviours. We don't have enough doctors, and we had doctors retiring early or cutting their days to avoid what was called the taper tax. But what's quite interesting is um, that they kept the symmetry between private pensions and sort of civil service pensions in that respect. And that leads to would they have to do the same on employers' NI? So if you have this situation where pension contributions above a couple of £1,000 attract employers' NI, then it would seem to me only reasonable that you'd have to work out what the pension contributions were for the civil service pensions, and then the civil service would have to pay the government employers NI on those contributions. So I don't think you can have I don't think they can, given what they did in the past, have a different system. And that therefore might lead them to think, oh, actually, do we really want to do this? Because it's costing the money's going around in a circle. Um, the only pension scheme I'm aware of that got out of all this was for the judges. Um, they avoided it completely. So yeah, just as a bit of extra detail, but that
The sort of political economic problem at the heart of this, coming back to some of the discussion, is that the the pension rules and also the introduction of things like ISAs, etc., was all designed years ago to hopefully over time reduce the retirement burden on the state, i.e., in the sense the hope was everyone would have private savings, private sections, pensions, and you could sort of wind down the reliance on the state for pension income. That just hasn't happened. Um, so again, this whether that's going to drive anything specific in this budget, but that's one of the big problems they've got at the heart of the government is the rising pension bill and the fact that a lot of these, a lot of the way they've designed the system, the tax breaks around the pension system, hasn't really done anything to alleviate or solve that.
yeah.
Okay, thank you both. Another point about national insurance that's been in the headlines is the thought that LLP profits are falling outside the scope of employers' NI. What do you both think about them bringing that in?
Yeah, so I just explain. So as a member of an LLP, you're considered to be self-employed, and so the rate of national insurance on self-employed people is they just pay their class two, a few quid a week, and class four, which I think is now 8%. Um, on profits up to a certain level, then it caps at 2%. If you're if that we had a few years back a situation where because members of LLPs were not salaried, and therefore there wasn't what would now be the 15% employers NI. There were mainly law firms, I think, finding quite senior people who were not really partners, equity partners, and making them members, but on a fixed salary effectively in order just to avoid the employer's NI. Now there was there was some anti-avoidance to deal with that. And I think where this is coming from is this idea that if you look at kind of some of the biggest LLPs, I mean, take one of the big four accountancy firms. I can't think how many members they'll have, but it'll be over a couple of thousand members. And are they really self-employed? Are they really in business on their own account taking risk? Because probably not, in the sense that that individual member is not going to worry about that big four partnership going bust or worrying about paying the wages at the end of the month. If you go to the other end of the scale and you've got a partnership of, I don't know, an electrician, a plumber, and a carpenter getting together to do some building work together, they're self-employed, right? They are taking risk of their own account, and therefore they get the benefit of not paying, or they get the benefit of the lower NI rates that self-employed people pay. So I think the idea is that if it's not hitting general partnerships and it's only hitting LLPs, then that theoretically, in the government's view, not my view, is only impacting those much bigger businesses. The problem, of course, with that is that there are LLPs of all different sizes. So it's sort of a bit illogical. And as an example of irony, one of the biggest Magic Circle law firms is still actually a general partnership. I think Clifford Chance. No, I think it's Slaughter and May. So you could have this situation where the people they're actually targeting don't pay it, and the people they're not targeting end up paying it. So it's gone a bit quiet. I think it's incredibly problematic. I get where they're coming from, but it's not a one size fits all. So my view, unless Gus has a different view, is it won't happen.
No, I've got nothing to add on that. I don't know that LLPs is that interesting to this audience either. So we'll move on from that one. It's very interesting for us, but
It is.
Okay, and one last point then on income tax is, Matt, you've already mentioned it, is the fiscal drag, which we've seen the same personal allowances and income tax ban since I think 2020. Do you think that's going to continue?
I think it's just too tempting. It's just too tempting to not do it.
Yeah, it's the easy one. Every government has done it for the last 10 years, so why not keep doing it?
Okay, so I think that's everything on income tax, national insurance. What we'll go on to now is this thought of taxing wealth rather than work, which has been at the forefront of the manifestos that Labour have put ahead. So what we'll move on to first then is the thought of bringing in a wealth tax. What do you think about bringing in a wealth tax, Matt?
So it's got quite a lot of political traction, because I think, it obviously sounds quite attractive in terms of if a wealth tax of, I think it was 2% was levied on assets over 10 million, it would raise about 28 billion every year. So the numbers, you can stand up in Parliament and say that, and it sounds fantastic. There's a couple of things. One is, if you look across other countries that have done it, they've not been particularly successful. So I'm uncertain that it would ever collect those amounts. But what I think is probably more insightful is, if I think about tax changes that the Treasury have made, we've still got the same Inheritance Tax Act that we've had since 1984, the same Capital Gains Tax Act since 1992, and all changes have effectively been some sticking plasters, some bits of anti-avoidance. We've never done anything particularly new. The last sort of new thing I think we did was what's called ATED, annual tax on envelope dwellings, which was actually quite a straightforward new tax to implement, because it was just like a levy on properties that you'd put into a company. I just can't see that they could build the structure, the tax collection structure in this parliament, right? And they need answers to tomorrow, not next parliament. So I just can't see it. I just can't see it being top of their agenda.
This is sort of at the heart of why we've got a bit of a messed up tax system at the moment, is that probably the things that make economic and fiscal sense are sort of 5 or 10 year programs of reform and change. Um, and there's just been no incentive to do that, because all the incentive around the budget is this short-term golden rule of meat and borrowing. So it's almost not worth putting in the hard work of something that, and all of these things, have the huge potential to actually drop your tax income in the first couple of years, but try and create a more sustainable system in the long term. It's a bit of a waste of time in government to do if all they're going to be judged on is the OBR. I think I think there is obviously huge political pressure from the left on a wealth tax. I don't think they're going to buy it, because I just don't, as Matt says, it's not clear that it works. Um, what they would like to do is fundamentally reform the whole, tax ecosystem around property. Um, and if you think, property is the one immovable sort of aspect of wealth, and it's also by far, if you're looking at the pots of where money sits, most sort of obvious wealth that people hold is sort of in their property. So there's been rumors that they're looking to change council tax and change stamp duty and essentially implement some form of CGT, all of these things. But as Matt says, that's the way government moves and works, that's something that's going to take 5 to 10 years. So are
Yeah.
they going to sort of flag it up now? Are they going to try and set in motion some sort of broader reform process? And again, this is where we're looking at there's probably sort of two factions within government, one arguing that we should, one arguing that we haven't. We're not going to find out until budget day which one of those has won.
That's good.
Okay, so the talk of things like a wealth tax, I think, are making wealthy people think, should we go abroad? And actually, I think Nick Evans has asked that question in the Q&A. Um, I just want to, so has been talk about a possible exit tax. I don't think we have any figures of how much that would raise, but Matt, how do you think that would
So an
that would?
exit, yeah, so an exit tax is this idea that it can work in a number of ways, but it's common, right? So in the US, you have this situation where if you want to give up your citizenship, it's as though you've sold everything you own and you pay the capital gains tax as you leave. Um, so there is a logic to it. Um, because if you were going to bring in an exit tax, the last thing you do is tell people you're going to bring in an exit tax, because you don't want them to go before they have exited. I think also, um, my guess is no, partly because of the implementation issues, and actually secondly because if we think about what they have done with the non-doms, etc., what they've done with residency and domicile inheritance tax, they've sort of dealt with it in their minds. They've kind of dealt with it in this idea of having, like, if you come here and you become long-term residents, you pay inheritance tax, which is effectively a type of wealth tax. And if you're living here, you retain your kind of your IHT domicile or about 10 years after you've left. So I won't go into the detail, but essentially they kind of I think in their minds they kind of dealt with that situation. It's not perfect, but I think they brought some fairness to the situation, um, for the internationally mobile people. The question from Nick, am I seeing people leaving? Yes. Yeah, we are seeing people relocating overseas, and but actually I don't think it's because of a wealth tax. I think it's just because of um it's mainly around sort of capital gains taxes, when they're exiting a business. And because if they're exiting a business and they're retiring, they don't need to be here. So there is always that temptation to, well, why didn't I go somewhere else? But what I think is going to change people's views quite a lot, and it's not an easy one to get around anyway, but I don't think people quite realize that we've had the inheritance tax changes to bring in a restriction on business relief. But I don't think people have really understood quite how bad that is. So I give an example of a 30 million pound business, and say it's roughly got now an IHT bill of 6 million. That inheritance tax bill is not the company's bill; it's the executor's bill. And so if the only money to pay that bill is in the company's got to pay dividends to the executors to pay the inheritance tax. So in a very, very simple example, okay, you've got 10 years to pay it and you don't have to pay any interest, but that effectively means the company's got to do about 1.3 million a year, pay £300,000 of corporation tax, to pay the dividend tax, to pay the £600,000 a year. So it's not a £6 million problem. It's a £13 million problem. And if the value of the business just reduces, it's not making those profits. I don't see at the moment any way of going back to the revenue and saying, actually, it's not worth 30 million anymore. So I think when these things start to become more apparent to people, I actually think that will be what results in people looking at actually leaving the UK, because they'll be looking at huge amounts of tax, and you can go to Jersey, pay £250,000 a year flat rate of tax. I think that's my worry is I'll be relocating to advise people in Jersey or Guernsey rather than from Swansea.
So I mean, I think the short answer is yes, certainly we're seeing more noise around it, but it's not quite as straightforward as people often think it is. I think it's fair to say as well, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah, it's not.
Okay, thank you both.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to move on to the potential for capital gains tax on your own sort of residential property. Currently, you can have unlimited private residence relief on your own residence. There's talks about restricting that to properties over maybe £1 million or £2 million. Do you think that could potentially come in?
My guess would be no. But if it does come in, I think it's worth just so at the moment, we have a system where it doesn't really matter how valuable the house is. There is a restriction on, if you've got acres and acres of garden, does it all come within your PPR? But that generally doesn't affect many people. We have had changes to property capital gains tax on property. They've messed around with the rates, I don't know how many times. And they also brought CGT in for non-residents on UK property, first with residential and then with commercial property. And in each of those instances, there was rebasing. So effectively, say I bought a property, I'm living in Spain, I got a property in the UK, I bought it 20 years ago and it only cost me £100,000, but when it was rebased in, I think it was 2017, it was worth £1 million. It was only the gain from that rebasing of £1 million when the rules changed that I had to worry about. And the reason for that is you can't really have like retrospective rules, particularly when you didn't think to keep the records of all the money you spent on it. So I think my guess would be when they look at it, they'll go, well, actually, that's all very well, but we're going to have rebasing. How the hell are we going to do that? Okay, that's self-assessment. They can just give the valuation. And then it becomes less sort of meaningful in terms of the tax it's going to raise, because everyone's going to go and get a high valuation for their property on the day of rebasing. And then they go, it's not worth it. So my guess is when they look at the detail, they think it's just not worth it and go back to what Gus is saying. You go back to, look, we've just got to do something that moves the dial quickly and securely, not uncertain.
Yeah, I mean, but properties one, it's been, the golden rule of politics the last 20 or 30 years has been that if price rises are going up, your get re-elected. If they're going down, you'll get kicked out of office. So every government has done everything it can to sort of maintain, not do anything to impact the housing market. But and look, I'm invested in property. I think most people, if you made a few quid in this country, you've probably invested in property. That's the problem. We're massively over invested in property at the moment, and part of it is because of, if you look at the biggest, I'm going to be extremely unpopular in saying this, probably one of the biggest differentials in terms of CGT is in your primary residence. You pay relatively, compared to the value of your primary residence, we pay practically nothing in tax on that. I know stamp duty, etc., has gone up, but sort of ignoring that at the moment. And there's big debate about whether you should front end it. This comes back to sort of front loading people. We should probably get rid of stamp duty and tax things at the other end, but that pushes your tax receipts out, doesn't do the government any good. So it falls into this: what's the right thing to do? What's economically versus what's the right thing to do politically is different, versus what's the right thing to do to plug the hole in the short-term hole in the finances. And they all sort of compete with each other, so nothing ever gets done around property. So it'll probably be the same again.
Okay, thank you both. The other CGT point is the thought of aligning the rates with the current income tax rates. Do you think that might come in?
So to answer that question, you sort of look at the history, just as quick as I can, but we've never really had capital gains tax aligned with income tax unless we've had indexation allowance. And then I think it was 98, would have been Brown, wouldn't it? So indexation allowance went, and they went to what they thought was a simpler system of taper relief, which is quite common across Europe. This idea of the tax rate tapers and non-business asset taper relief. It went from 40 to I think 24 over a 10-year period. Funnily enough, before you could get to 24, they changed the rules. So we got rid of tapering relief, and we went to a flat rate, and I think it was Darling that brought in the flat rate of 18%, and I think it was actually Osborne that increased it. So bizarrely, Labour have been a lot kinder with capital gains tax than the Conservative Party, and by some distance. Brown brought in business asset taper relief, unlimited gains on businesses taxed at 10%. So when I look at that history, will they do it? No, I don't think they will, because then they've got to go back to the complication they sought to avoid in the first place. I think they've just forgotten all the things they've done in between, and when they look at it, they go, "Oh, crikey, we tried to get away from these problems, and now we're going to go back to them." So those are my thoughts. No.
Okay. Another one, which is sort of to do with taxing wealth, is reducing ISA limits. Gus, I know you mentioned that already. Do you think the limits will be reduced?
I think we've seen a pattern of, so we've already seen CGT exemption limits sort of reduce over time. I think we will. But it's not clear. The trouble, ISA limits don't really bring you in any tax receipts is the problem. Simply reducing the ISA limit from 20 to 10,000 pounds doesn't bring you anything in the short term. So they might be tempted to leave it, but obviously it does. The problem, when 100 billion pounds in cash went into cash ISAs last year, record amount, and that has two massive impacts. One, people are hugely encouraged just to shove their money away, cash it away in an ISA and not spend it, which is not good for the economy. And then the other thing is that 100 billion tends to just sit in cash deposits, which is not good for the economy. So again, the right thing to do would be to try and solve some of that, because what you want to do is get some of that money spending to drive the economy. But also, one of the big problems in the UK is really we don't have a strong sort of startup capital ecosystem, particularly in Wales. What you really want is to encourage people to start investing their cash into business and small business and into more riskier ventures. Whereas the whole system at the moment really drives people to just shoving their cash away in a corner out of the way of the tax man. So again, I'd like to see them try and address something around that. Simply reducing the ISA limit doesn't really achieve much. So it's a question of, are they going to do that with a wider set of reforms that will encourage more risk-based investing, particularly investing in small business or investing in your own business?
Okay, thank
We've
you.
got some questions to go to. I don't know if we're waiting those then. I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah, I think Lauren, if you want, is there a couple of things that we need to deal with? I think there were.
The last tax really that we need to look at is inheritance tax. So obviously we've already seen some major changes, as Matt mentioned earlier, the restriction of business relief to £1 million and then 50% thereafter, and the pension reforms, which will bring unspent pension pots within the charge to IHT from April 2027. I think the question is, are more reforms needed to raise the revenue that the government would like to raise?
Yeah, so I think, so what is it? IHT
So I think
7
some
billion.
reports have suggested, increasing the limit of seven, the sort of time period of 7 years to 10 years, restrictions on the amount of lifetime gifts you can give away in a total year, that sort of thing. Have you got any thoughts on that?
It's got a bit quiet. So the idea that, if you make a gift and live 7 years, it's outside of IHT. There's tapering after 3. So there's two schools of thought. One is to just, going back to my sticking plasters, be very easy just to change the rules to go, right now it's 10 years and maybe the tapering's different. That would be very easy to do. A more fundamental thing would be just a total limit on lifetime gifts. So in the US, it's like $5 million. So it doesn't matter when you gave it away. It doesn't matter if you lived 1 year or 8 years or 2 days. It's just once you've given away more than $5 million, anything in excess of that. My guess is not. I think it needs, if they look at it properly, it's like it's what is needed is something more fundamental, and that will come out of when they start to see how they deal with the increases to the IHT without the business relief and reduction in business relief. I don't think. I think it's got a bit quiet there. I think IHT is working quite nicely for them. It's raising a lot of money as it is, and will raise more with the restriction on business relief. We've got a couple of questions as well. I think we've dealt with one of them, Lauren. There's a very tax one. Stamp duty on share purchases. Ooh, I think it's gone. There was a lot of talk about that, but I think no, it went quite quiet. I think there was a lot of furor from, because we are still quite one of the biggest financial markets in the world. So if you start becoming less attractive, you're just asking financial markets to go elsewhere, and there are people that will compete for that. So I don't think that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one that's probably off the table, because I think they just they've got fingers crossed and hoped, like a lot of governments do, that banking and the financial system is one of our strengths here.
Yeah.
And sort of in the current economic environment, doesn't make sense to do anything to risk that.
There's a specific question on salary sacrifice and cycle to work. I think cycle to work will be. I think they're just talking about pensions. Okay.
Yeah, agree. I think they're if they're just going to put income tax up, I don't think they're going to start messing around with too many of the cycle work and other things. I think if getting rid of cycle to work, salary sacrifice, and other stuff got them to their 40 billion number, they'd probably go down that route, but it's just not going to. So.
And there's two more. There's one I can't answer. Sorry, Marco. In terms of a proper analysis. So the question is, they keep increasing taxes. Are they actually doing a proper analysis of spending cuts?
So I mean, I can give a very quick. The trouble is, and you'll see that I think Elon Musk Doge in the US has actually driven up the cost of government. There's only 3 ways you can cut spending. It is in the UK, it's NHS benefits pensions. Can't really touch pensions. NHS needs more money. Um, so you got benefits. It do that, this is one of the ironies. So the Conservatives made it in theory harder and harder to sort of go on to benefits and survive in benefits, and it resulted in an additional 1.5 million people claiming long-term sick. Um, and so the government know, and because they told me this, but they know why that is. That the system, if you take the average person who's going off, the reason that benefits is rising, it's someone sort of in their 50s, losing their job, or has been in a trade and simply can't go up on the roofs anymore. There's not really anything there to support them. The only option they've really got, if they can't get another job, is to go on to long-term sick. And once you're on long-term sick, there is no way you're ever giving that up. So the only way that system needs fundamental reform to bring it in line to other systems. That is a lot of work, and it's going to take a long time. And again, it comes back to the reality actually to reform the system, your costs are probably going to go up in the short term. And that's comes back to this problem of always having to hit this OBR target. If you actually wanted to reduce long term the benefit bill, it's got to be a long term plan to do so. That's going to cost you money up front. And that's why every government has just sort of looked at it and thought, oh, sod, it's too difficult, we'll leave it. So I hope, one's for all of our sanity, for the economy, for the broader issues, one has got to hope that they are going to do, start implementing some fundamental reform, but are they prepared to do the hard work to do so?
Thanks, Gus. There's one last question on anything for landlords to worry about, which reticent to answer because landlords have forever been in the sights. And of course, if they swap 2% NI for a 2% increase in income tax, then yes, that will hit landlords and pensioners. Is there anything else? I don't think there's anything else. I think that everything that can be done has been done. The only thing landlords should worry about is there's a lot of very dodgy schemes out there. Property 118, SKS Bailey. Just look at Dan Nidell's comments. Anytime someone says, "Oh, do this, put it in a company, and we can save you tax," just be so careful because there is so much stuff out there that is just wrong. And if you really want to read about it, read Spotlight 63. I don't really want to finish on that note, but I think we are. I think that is our last question. Yeah, it is. That is.
Well, I mean, look, if we want to end on positive, I think the government absolutely is gonna not try and do anything that directly impacts small businesses because we have been up in arms for the last 12 months. And everything we told them 12 months ago around NI and national minimum wage increases were going to absolutely kill the entry-level jobs market has sort of come true. Um, are they going to do anything positive for businesses? The bit of that, it comes back to this, they've created these issues in the entry level job market. We've got increasing number of people 17 to sort of 24 not in employment or education. Um, are they going to sort of pull something out of the hat to try and appease business and boost the economy? If they do so, I think it's going to be something around that entry level recruitment, some sort of benefit to businesses who are taking on apprenticeships or creating apprenticeships or something around that. They might just signal it in this budget. I don't know that they've got anything worked out, but that's the noisiest area where there might be something sort of positive coming out for businesses. Is look, if you're taking on school leavers, graduates, if you're training people up, is there some sort of additional relief or additional funding that the businesses can get? Because that's their number one sort of economic and social problem at the moment. It's the long-term impact of having people, in their late teens, early 20s, not working or learning anything is sort of horrendous for all of us. So there might be something sort of positive at that end.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
We could do with some positivity.
Okay, thank you both for all of for answering all the questions. So the budget, as a reminder, is on the 26th of November. We'll be doing a second webinar on the 26th at 4 o'clock for you to join. And I think those invites will be sent out probably in the next week or so. Okay, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you again on the 26th.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.